there we go.
By the way, you can get this game on Steam, the platform, for €9, I think.
It's the best €9 you'd ever spend.
Yeah, you can get it on Steam for €9.
Because eventually the story gets real. There's a resistance movement that comes in, gives you codes to decipher, and your son gives you a drawing. You can choose to put it up in the box, and you get an automatic citation by the officer who shows up for a surprise visit the next day. It's hilarious. All right, gentlemen. Let's start with Konstantin. You've experienced Papers, Please, of course, in the past. What are the challenges behind? Sure, some of the issues here are given slightly candidly by the game. There's an inherent maybe humor. There's a dark humor to it. But what are the challenges of implementing such a serious issue in what is essentially interactive entertainment?
I think, my background is mainly games for education, right, and games for learning. And the interesting thing is the idea of creating a game that kind of like can teach something is beautiful, right? And like Maria Montessori made quite a name with that. However, it is really hard because you can smell it. We call them chocolate-covered broccolis, right? They are not healthy, not sweet. So it's kind of like this problem that a lot of educational games don't really reach people. What kind of like he made in this game is, on one hand, it is kind of like, it's an interesting one. Is it entertaining? As you have seen, there is something boring about it. However, a lot of games have boring stuff around them. So I think what he really managed is doing something that we would call the mechanic is the message, right? What you do is already what he tries to teach us. And by doing what we do, we get into these ethical dilemmas that you can speak about more, I think. But I think that's kind of like the challenge that he took and perfectly, I think, designed in this game.
Wow, very good. And speaking of Lucas
sorry,
Pope,
if I'm allowed, just to jump in.
Of course, please interrupt me.
You guys think that this is boring. Believe me, I was like, this is going to be a nightmare. But when you start playing it, you go so much into it. At some point, it was like 11 o'clock in the evening, and I was screaming at the computer. I don't care if your husband is in the country; you're not coming in. Okay, seriously, it's very addictive. It's very, very addictive.
And on the point of Mr. Pope, the mind behind this wonderful, this tiny masterpiece, as I've called it before, the inspiration for it came from the fact that he is married to a Japanese lady, and going back and forth from the States to Japan, the passport check at Japan essentially inspired him to do this. Now, I don't know how harsh passport control is in Japan, but yeah, I want to thank the officers in Japan for inspiring the man. Now, speaking of ethics and morality, Mr. Kyriakou will tell us a little bit more about what is it. First of all, empathy simulator. Is it fair to call this game an empathy simulator?
So, do people know what empathy is? So empathy,
I hope so.
it comes from a Greek word actually, and pathos, meaning feeling the feelings of other people. Let's say, being in the passion of other people. That's the etymology coming out of it. And empathy simulator, what you mean, I guess, is the ability that morally and psychologically normal people tend to have. The ability to be able to stand in the shoes of other people and feel their pain and feel their joy and so on. And I say morally and psychologically normal people because we know that psychopaths, they can't really stand in your shoes. They have what we call cognitive empathy. They understand what you feel, but they don't feel it and they don't care. So it is widely considered in the literature that more people tend to have emotional empathy. They can feel your pain and your joy and so on. It's a requirement for being a moral and normal psychological person. Deeply amoral people, like some serial killers, not all serial killers are psychopaths or deeply amoral. But vicious people, sadistic people, psychopaths tend to be lacking in this psychological ability. So, but before that, I wanted to raise a few questions about the whole setup of the game. I mean, the game is really interesting, I would say, because it raises all these kind of questions, moral questions in moral philosophy, political philosophy, legal philosophy, questions like what is right or wrong. I mean, just because something is legal, does it make it moral? Does something that is moral need to be also legal? Do you have to be submissive to authority? When do we need authority? I mean, state authority at all? All these questions are fascinating and are being raised by the game. Another question that is being raised and is very, it's a moral dilemma really, is the question whether we have the moral right to sacrifice the welfare of many people just for the sake of one we love, like our son. That's something that comes up and up again in the game. Yeah. So these are basic questions, moral, political, legal, psychological questions that the game raises. Yeah.
I bet you didn't expect to hear about serial killers at a chat about Papers, Please, huh? So it's definitely an interesting evening as it's shaping up to be. Now, you've mentioned, Konstantin, you've mentioned how a game can be an educational tool. And this eventually will be asked to both of you. Can a game be used, I'm not going to use the word propaganda, but can it be used for the reverse effect of an educational tool?
Yeah, I think funny enough, in that exhibition there are a lot of games by Mole Industria, and the guy who made those games is saying he's only doing propaganda games. He's just doing the right propaganda, right? For instance, and it's an interesting one because I think if you make a game, you automatically make a statement, right? And there's a lot of discussion in the gaming world. You know, for instance, there are some simulations where you allow people to do stuff that you didn't even intend to, and then the question is, was that okay or not okay? And there's big drama around that. The interesting thing here, I would say, is, and I think that's what he's doing in an interesting one, and I think that's one of the parts where it gets a masterpiece, is he's not saying that this is wrong. You know, he kind of like he puts you in the shoes to have these ethical dilemmas, and you choose by yourself, you know, how to deal with it. Of course, there are certain circumstances by the government, you know, that are ruled on you. But I think that's the interesting part, and I think this makes it also interesting for education to put people into the position through a game where you have the ethical dilemma, and then you can discuss it, right? And then you suddenly have a good ground to talk about it or get deeper into the topic, versus saying, oh, here is the right decision, right? This is what you need to do and this is the wrong thing to do.
So it's morally ambiguous, let's say, or there are some forms of art, or let's stick to video games specifically, obviously, that maybe the message, or at least what is given to the player, can be perceived as negative. And this I want to ask Christos: how morally responsible can the creator of such a work of art, and video games are art, and that's a fact, how morally responsible is the creator of such a game? Because I can play this game and be an absolute government drone. I'll be the perfect government drone without a heart, like a machine, let's say, which can be seen as evil from one point of view, let's say. How morally responsible is the creator for making me do that?
Well, I guess it's morally irresponsible to create games that you justifiably believe that they will have an adverse effect on the minds of, I don't know, gamers.
Well, that brings up a huge question about gun violence. But
Hello.
well, we're not going to get into that.
Yeah, but that's, I guess it's questionable whether violent games adversely affect the psychology of gamers. But if it could be established empirically via, I don't know, psychological studies that it adversely affects or inclines to be people to be more violent, then that would be morally responsible, given this knowledge, to proceed with developing such games.
And there has been no empirical data as to the correlation between gun violence and violence in films or video games. Just so we're clear, this is not a line has not been drawn between the two. Okay. I want to state that. Now, back to the creation of a game as a learning tool. Have you worked on something recently?
Yes.
Do please tell us more.
So I think an interesting one from my experience is, I would say, back in the days, there was still the hope that you can create these games, right? And I think the issue is always that these games can then on its own be educational tools. And I would say right now the learning is that it's a context question, right? So for instance, you mentioned this topic, that he had issues getting into Japan. So I think, for instance, it would be interesting to play this game here in Nicosia or in Cyprus, right? It is a different thing if you play this game here in schools than if you would come to Germany or Austria. I don't even know where the border starts or ends. I just pass by, right? And the border is clear, right? And legally accepted on both sides. So we don't even, tap into that issue. But I think an interesting one is this context question. So I would say in my own work, we, for instance, created a Stadt der Wörter, which is like a Goethe-Institut learning game where you can learn German in like 2 hours easily. Still, you should book courses. But the point would be today that we realize it is about the context that you can really provide. That means, for instance, I today only make games where I have the context, for instance, a trainer or a coach that then debriefs what happens here. You can imagine putting these games in front of 20 kids. You will have 20 different opinions. If you have a facilitator, a teacher, a trainer that is able to express what's happening here, talk with them about it, see the reference points, make them understand the topic, then it gets really interesting. And I think this is kind of like what I find most interesting in the moment of using these games in the right contexts.
Context is key in art in general, because you need to see where the creator is coming from and what the message is they're trying to convey. Now, last time we did Orwell, I didn't open up the questions to the crowd early on, and I think there's probably a lot of them tonight. Does anyone, just so we can start a proper conversation, hands up, does anyone have a question? Anything at all?
Well,
no.
I want to start.
Mr. Psilidis, of course.
I want to start this round off. Well, my question is mainly to the philosophy doctor. This game gave me vibes resonating the Milgram experiment. Okay, the experiment, for those who don't know it, it's a famous psychological experiment where people were required to administer shock to other people under the guidance of a authority figure.
Electric shocks.
Electric shocks. Thank you very much, sir. And the people who did it, they thought they were administering the shock. They were listening to pre-recorded audio screaming by actors. They didn't actually hurt anyone, but they were meant to think that they were hurting people. And the experiment was meant to measure whether or not we respond to authority figures. Basically, if someone orders you to do something, where's the point where you say, you know what, no, this goes against my beliefs, it goes against my ethics, I'm not doing it, okay? And it was a resounding failure, by the way, for humanity. So, do you believe that it gives it has a vibe like that? Like the game, like makes you into questioning your choices?
Yeah, I mean, both the experiments, the Milgram experiments and situations like that where you have to be submissive to authority and where the direction of authority are morally questionable, raise the question whether I should submit to authority at all. And we know that from the Second World War II. I mean, the classic excuse of the Nazi members in the Nuremberg trials was that, so when they were asked by judges, why did you participate in the whole situation with the final question and exterminating the Jews and so on, they were saying, I was following orders. That was the excuse. As if you are following orders, you don't have the choice to say no. The Milgram experiments, the historical experience shows that most people are inclined to submit to authority blindly, especially if that blind submission to authority works to their benefit.
Yeah. Maybe they had a sick son at home.
but there is a but.
or a gun to their head.
Or a gun to the head.
Yeah. Thank God there is a but. Because even in the midterm experiments, a minority of the people participating in the experiment, at some point they just said, no, I'm not going to continue using more and more electric shock to people that are causing them pain, unnecessary pain, and so on. And I'm not an expert in World War II history, but I have a vague feeling that some people didn't want to participate in the whole Holocaust.
Sure.
The concentration camps and everything.
Okay.
They just said no.
My question is answered.
Of
Thank you very
course,
much.
the game gives you the authority because eventually you start getting more powers, like the power to have people arrested, and all the way down to the end they give you a key for a gun case that in case someone tries to run, you can open up the gun case and shoot them. First it's a tranquilizer gun, and then it's a real gun. Is that a lesson that's generally okay to be given to people who play games, especially people who are, let's say, someone who is under 15 years old who would be playing this game? A question to both of you, actually, because there's no real control. When you buy this game on Steam, there's no real control if the person playing it is above 18 or not. Is this a title that is appropriate for a teenager?
I think the interesting thing is when we think about it that way, there is a context where you play the game, but there's also a context, as you mentioned, what the game is representing, right? And that's another thing. The game already has a certain form of style and humor. People out there would say it doesn't look realistic, right? That harms people a lot. Imagine this is picture realistic, right? And videos, and then you shoot somebody. I think that would be a completely different cup of tea, right? So I think the fact that he was able to transfer it in this fictive world, and I think so. But then we are exactly in that juicy topic when games get really interesting when it comes to ethics. So I would say the fact that it is presented the way it is and clearly teaches you about the ethical problems of border control and of following orders, it seems to be okay because they lead you down the dark way, right? And you know it. But just change a little bit on the colors and of the style, and suddenly you have a really, really problematic game that would not make it in Germany on the market.
Yeah, that's safe to say.
And to Mr. Kyriakou, is this? Do you have any children? It's a personal question, but do you have children?
Yeah.
How young?
3 and 2.
Okay, really young. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't let them play this game.
Well, that was my question actually, because you've studied ethics and morality ad nausea, I'm sure. Would you let your 14-year-old or 15-year-old play this, with your guidance, of course, just so you can observe them?
I think it would be a good educating experience because it raises a whole lot of questions. Some of them we already mentioned. But just by playing it doesn't mean that someone is sensitive to the questions. I mean, especially at a young age. Of course, someone might be precocious and realize the questions and think about them. It would be, I think it's a good way to be introduced to more philosophy actually, because it raises all these kind of questions. And yes, I would love to instruct my boy playing that. Yeah, but I hope he doesn't get addicted.
Yeah, he's not going to get addicted to this
That is a
game.
whole other can of worms that we can get into if you want. Are video games addictive? The simple answer to that, by the way, spoiler alert, video games, we have addictive personalities that can get addicted to video games. Some video games are designed to be addictive. Yes, the end. But as you said about your son in this game, maybe you can watch The Dark Knight together. But the moral dilemma with the prisoners in one boat and the citizens in the other, and they will have the right to explode the other boat. See who does it first. So, are there any questions? Please.
Hi. I'm not too sure it's a question, more so like, statement or, some food for thought. we said from the start that this is an educational game. We said the same sort of as well. I think from an ethical point of view, this is an educational game. I think the same goes for the other game a couple of weeks ago, Orwell.
Orwell.
And our children nowadays are exposed to so much information from social media, the news, and most of it without them having to make any choices. So I think to a certain extent, games like this, of course with the right guidance, but games like this can give kids the opportunity to reflect and use their own critical thinking as to whether, you know, despite where they might stand or the families might stand in the matters of security or migration or, you know. So I think at the end of the day, it is an educational. I think it's we should be investing more in games that explore topics that are day-to-day topics and that give the opportunity for people to reflect and use their own critical thinking.
Oh, I'm with you, personally.
If I can add to that, I think it's a perfect statement, so I think it doesn't need an answer. The interesting thing I would add is it falls in the frame of an educational game. I think it's not designed as an educational game. So this guy, he won all the awards, you know, that are more game design, indie game design, and almost all the games you see here are not designed for educational purposes. And I think this is interesting because one thing I found, and I'm also guilty of that, because I am a person who has a company that designs games for other people's person. The Goethe-Institut comes to me and says, we want a game about X, and I'm going to create it for them, right? These people don't do it. They create something as artists, expressing their own opinion or their beliefs about a system, propaganda, through a game. And this is where the magic happens. That's, I think, why these games are special, all the ones you can see here, because they have that power. And I think I realize, for instance, if we design a game, I need to find a game designer who fully believes in this. But imagine you have to, you know, teach a math problem. You know, yes, it's very interesting, but I think what that's very special about these games, that they come from a person's opinion. And I think one thing we will see in the future is it's easier and easier to create games, technology-wise, not good games, but still, like, the tools are much easier. So I think it will be interesting to see if a younger generation is going to use games as an expressive tool for how they see the world, and thereby allow others to experience the world the way they see it. And I think this is what's already happening in these games, and I think I see a future where this will get more and more important.
Just by seeing what people do with Minecraft is
Oh my God.
and that's just surface stuff, just design. That's it. Anyone else? Any other questions?
The lady.
So again, something at the same context as yours. I mean, isn't any type of a game, I mean, between any living creature that actually plays, yeah, like it's a human or it's a puppy, yeah. We play to learn something. And I think what is always in the context of a game is the ethic parts of things. How much am I allowed to pick on you? What am I allowed to do? So any type of game, and especially video games nowadays, I think by definition they're educational, and by definition they have to do with basic ethical questions. So maybe a question could be, can we all start looking at any game that we play, even if it's just for spending your time, putting things in order, yeah? Is it a type of a process that we need to really understand at the front part of our brains rather than just doing it automatically? Because this is what entertainment is at the same time, is being allowed to make mistakes, yeah? And having fun with trying to stretch the borders, yeah? The barriers, yeah. That.
Well, I'll just take a minute here. Good games, like AAA games, that's what they're called, like the big tentpole games. Those are the ones that, well, it can't be, it's not that they're educational, but there is some ethical value, that because most of them are story driven, but the games that are making money, like serious money, for a long period of time, those are designed merely with an addictive mindset. You would not believe the thinking that goes behind making those games, down to they can calculate the moment where you will stop playing the game to get to the next level or the next award, grinding, that's what it's called, and you are willing to pay them money, and they can pinpoint that second, that moment where you decide to give the game money with an accuracy of hours. It's scary how that happens. Yes, oh my God, conditioning. It's
You're still practicing hand and eye coordination, so
Yes.
there's a small angle there.
Yeah.
Or all the most of the Assassin's Creed titles are strewn with human history and great history lessons. Actually, the last two, you can actually do a tour of the historical locations without fighting at all. Egypt and Greece, irrelevant. Morality, politics. This is what we're focusing here. How games and politics can meet somewhere in the middle, and sometimes they create something beautiful, but sometimes it's inherently dark, like what is that game? The war game. We have it.
Call
right
of
there.
Duty.
No. This War of Mine. This War of Mine is another example of well, it's a role-playing game. But you get to, I don't know if is that pushing it too far? You play the role of survivors of what is essentially the Bosnian War, how they go about day-to-day survival. Is that too much, or is there still something that can be learned from showing that experience to someone who might have no idea of what living like that would be like?
I think to start with this question, there is a nice example from Ralph Costa. He made a nice book. If you're interested in game design, it's like a comic book about game design. But he gives the example of Tetris, and he says Tetris is, for instance, not a moral game, right? Like you play Tetris and you're completely fine. But he said, what if you would now take humans instead of Tetris pieces? Still pretty okay, right? But if you say mass grave or Auschwitz or something, you just change the title of the game and suddenly you have a big ethical dilemma, right? Still the same game, same mechanics, nothing has changed, just 2 or 3 little twists, and suddenly there's a game none of us probably would play in this room, right? So I think it's very easy to make a game very ethical, and I think you're right. I think there are a lot of things you can discuss in games about ethics. The question is, as you mentioned, if that question comes even up, right? And I think a lot of ethical topics are not even addressed, even the ones that were designed for it. I'm sure people play Papers, Please don't get into that at all, right? They just play it and they have fun, or so I think that's an interesting one, and it comes back to the context question. And I think as educators, our job is to enrich the context, right? I think that's the goal.
I've had runs where it was just how much money can I make? Like I don't care about what people feel. I'm just gonna do the best high score I can in terms of money. Yeah. Any more questions?
I just wanted to ask, what was the title of the book that you mentioned?
The title of the book, it's from Ralph Costa, and I will let you know after the talk. It's something, if you give Ralph Costa in Amazon, you'll find it. I think it's called something game design, but I will look it up for you.
Do you think that if there would be like videos or something where they like really show what will happen to the people who don't come in the country, that they will die, or something else, or like the prostitutes, like how they feel or how they live in the city, that it would affect the player more? Like if there would be like visual something, scenes?
That sounds likely. I mean, if you show the consequences of your decisions, pictures of course can affect us, and we can feel sorry for our decisions, and then maybe in retrospect we change our mind, and yeah.
And you know, to keep it diverse, the interesting thing here is, for instance, it just says your son, like your son is sick, and why do you even care, right? It's what most people don't even have a son playing this game, right? So, but the interesting thing is that's the story, the narrative of you have a son you care for is a grand narrative that perfectly works, right? Of course, we want to make sure that our son is not dying, right? So it would be interesting. Imagine if they would show pictures of your son or video, you might not identify anymore, right? So I think there's also something, maybe because it's so abstract and so unclear, that you probably even identify more. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the question you just addressed, I mean, it raises a question that it raises a kind of question about the whole setup of the game. It just seems very unemotional, because you don't have to do with pictures, real people who you know, have emotions. I mean, even the expression of emotions by people who want to pass through the gate are just saying some expressions and they just disappear. I mean, the characters are not developed. You don't identify with them. You don't read their emotions. So it's not a very good representation of real life, let's say. It's just a game that leaves a lot outside the, yeah.
It's a bit like real life drone operators, US drone operators. They want to keep them as far away from, who they are firing upon. It makes their job easier. There's actually a game like that here, where you get to control a drone and you have the decision, do you fire the missile or not? Even if you decide not to, the system will fire the missile itself because someone else is controlling it, which raises the other question: who watches the watchman? Who watches the authority? Who gives them orders? And so on and so forth. Is there any more questions?
Yeah, that the lady in the back.
Hello. I'd like to expand to this point that was previously said about consequences and how people realize that the choices they make in this game, they actually affect people's lives. So I've spent a few hundred hours on this game myself.
Hello.
So at this point, just an example I remember, there is a woman, one of the prostitutes actually, that passes through the checkpoint, and she says, okay, there's this man that's going to pass in this day. His name is this, and if you let him pass, he'll kill me and my sister. Oh, please don't let him pass. The man passes on, and his papers are all right, so you have a choice. Do you ignore the woman's warning? Do you let him pass? Or do you not let him pass? So if you let him pass because his papers are all right, you see the next day, the newspaper article, one of the smaller titles, it says that these women were killed. So I believe, because I'm also a game developer, so as a developer, it's these small details that people notice, okay? So if you have an image of the women being killed, or if your son being sick or dying, it's the small details, it's the subtle details that that stay in people's mind, that catch people's attention. So you don't want to be forcing the message onto players, that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and again, that's I think what makes this game special, right? This is not, imagine if I don't know, I don't even know who does that. If like a government would pay a game designer to make this border control game to promote border control people, because it's such a hard job, right? We want to people should be nicer and they should respect, then you would never get a game like that, right? And I think it's exactly. There are not a lot of games like that. And imagine how the mechanic is so simple. It's a yes or no, and how he made this complicated world around it with a lot of ethical dilemmas is just really impressive. And it's beautiful to see that it touches some people really, and it has that potential, right? And in any way, I think a game can never reach everybody, right? There will be people that play this game and they don't get it, and it doesn't mean anything to them, and it's also fine, I guess, because there should be a big selection of games and one should fit.
Definitely, not everything is for everyone. I mean, that's a simple truth for humanity. Any more questions?
If I can add to that, because I think
can
that was
add.
one of the. I did a lot of interviews with gamers in my research about how games change the way they think about the world and their life, etc. And I found most gamers have that. Most gamers would say, I had an experience in a game that changed the way I think about stuff, right? And I think that's really meaningful and important. And I had this one interview, and it was about Metal Gear Solid. And about this, I don't even remember which one. There is this one scene where you fight somebody, an end boss, and you're told that everything is a hoax. You as a gamer were hired to do this because gamers are the most stupid people. They would just do whatever for points. It's all hoax. You killed everybody. You're the most evil person. Here is the end boss. He's definitely good. You're not. What are you going to do? And you, of course, or not, might be ethically be like, well, if I did everything wrong, I might have let that person live. But then the things as well, it's the best boss monster we have. So you now as a gamer, it's like, okay, I spent $50 on this game. Should I not play the final monster now just because I'm told it was wrong? And what people do is they're like, okay, I think I'm gonna kill that guy. So, and I think it was very interesting to see that games really, and I think even this game will, for some people in the world, give them a learning about ethical decisions that will have a deep impact on their lives. And I think there's something we should kind of not underestimate how much power games already have. And again, I think the future is going to be very much more about that. That people will have experiences in games that really mean something to them and where they will look back and say, well, I got that in that game. I will never forget it, and I have a different opinion now, for instance, on ethical dilemmas or something like that.
It's interesting you mentioned Mr. Kojima in his work. He always has something very interesting to say and present to the world, and I can't wait for Death Stranding because even he doesn't know what it is yet. So that's the interesting part about that. Is there any more questions? No? That's wonderful, because I want to wipe my memory and replay Mass Effect, the entire trilogy, because it touched my soul. Natalie, you have something to say before we wrap this up?
Yeah, so firstly, thank you for this very interesting discussion and sharing your ideas and views. I just wanted to quickly mention to everyone that we're offering free guided tours to the exhibition on Saturday at 10:30 in the morning and Monday at 6:30 in the afternoon. I think it's a very nice opportunity to see the exhibition and get more information on the games. And we also have the final event of our Games and Politics series, which is on the 16th, when we'll be screening war games. You can find the programs on your tables, as well as for our next series of events, which is the Weeks of the German Language, where we have many interesting film screenings, music, and many other events. So I think I would like to thank again everyone for joining us tonight, and I hope we'll be seeing you either at the tours or the exhibition or any other events. Thank you.
Thank you to Konstantin Mitkush from Playful Solutions and the lecturer of the University of Cyprus, Mr. Christos Kyriakou, for joining us.
Thanks, and for playing in the moderation. Wonderful.
And thanks to Mr. Psilidis for his awesome playing. I hope your son is fine. I noticed how you didn't care about the mother-in-law, and I'm writing that down.
My mother-in-law is an angel.
No, I believe you.
And ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fixos Masoudas.
Gute Nacht.